Hello, Northwest. We're looking at chapter 10 for our reading through Luke's Gospel this week. The chapter opens with Jesus sending a group of 72 of his followers ahead of him. He is heading to Jerusalem, and he knows that this will be the last opportunity he has to visit the villages and towns on the way. Jesus is trying to encourage his people in the ways of peace while he is still with them. The 72 followers return to Jesus and are amazed at the efficacy of their ministry in the Lord's power. Jesus tells them that he saw the forces of darkness defeated by the spreading of the news of God and the invitation to find life in the ways of God, the ways of peace. Jesus then thanks God that God continues to flip the world right side up by using unexpected people to reveal God's reality. Then the chapter moves into two stories that are very famous. In the second one, Martha is busy with serving and Mary is resting in Jesus' presence. The previous story of the Samaritan hero, which we'll look at in a moment, would cause one to think that Martha behaves more appropriately here. But Jesus says that Mary, who is resting and receiving from the presence of the Christ, has chosen the one thing that's necessary. A disciple's life consists of resting in God, being filled with God's light and strength, and loving the world from life lived in the empowering presence of God. Deep connection to God is essential for loving the world with the love of God. In the previous story, an expert of the law asks Jesus what is required to have life with God. In good Jesus fashion, he responds with a question of his own. What does the law say? The expert quotes Deuteronomy and Leviticus. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind and your neighbor as yourself. Jesus is very pleased with this response, but the law expert wants to justify himself, so he asks Jesus, well, who is my neighbor? Clearly, the expert wants to limit who should be loved as one's own self. But God's love is absolutely limitless. So fullness of life in God means limitless love. The parable Jesus tells would have been shocking in Jesus' context, for the story shows a Samaritan as the hero, the very one who exemplifies the love God is trying to cultivate within humanity. Jews and Samaritans were two rival communities in first century Palestine. Just a few paragraphs back, Jesus has to rebuke his own disciples for wanting to call down fire from heaven on a Samaritan village, OT style. The parable answers the expert's question about who is one's neighbor as universally as possible. There is no one who is not your neighbor. Even those who you think are your rivals and your enemies, God recognizes as neighbor. Every human being is called to find fullness of life in the endless giving and receiving flow of God's limitless love. This is a radical flipping of the typical human script, and it is the way to the future. It is the way to fullness. Notice too that the command isn't to love one's neighbor as much as yourself. It is to love your neighbor as yourself, as an extension of your very being. This is a love that is union at the deepest level imaginable. Like when Jesus prays in John's Gospel, that they may all be one. As you, Father, are in me and I am in you, may they also be in us, that they may be one. As we are one, I in them and you in me, that they may become completely one. The parable of the Samaritan hero shows us what we really are, what we all really are, even those we suppose as enemies, God's one absolutely beloved creation. What must we do to have life? Look like fools in the boundlessness of our love for all without remainder. Amen.